The battle for Avdiivka is over. Russia has won. Avdiivka has fallen, and its fall leads to some very unpleasant questions in the direction of Ukraine's actions in this context. But we'll talk about this and about other events along the front line, as well as in the rear areas in the situation report. We'll quickly start off with something off topic. As you might remember, we did a live stream on the German channel to collect donations for ambulances in Ukraine around Christmas, and some of you participated in donating. Just to those who participated, this is the 5th ambulance that was bought and is on its way into Ukraine, and 2 more have been chosen. After that, the money will be used up, but that means we collected enough money for 7 ambulances that are currently in the process of saving lives in Ukraine. Also, we now have more details about the German doctor that died in Ukraine. Obviously, highlighting individual persons is something that can be discussed in a context of a war where hundreds of thousands are dying. But we have a foreigner here, a woman who went there not to fight, but to save lives. And she did so for years, and until she finally became a victim of the war itself, in which she tried to save lives. And I think it's just appropriate to allow keeping her memory. This was Diana Savita Wagner with the call sign Snake, who has died in Ukraine on January 30th. About the general situation along the front lines here, we had additional heavy Russian air attacks, including Iskander ballistic missiles, Caliber S-300 surface-to-air missiles used in a ground-to-ground role, KH-59 and KH-101. There was a bigger strike now, again with guided missiles. Nothing out of the extraordinary, though. The Ukraine is reporting that they were successful in an attack on the Polyoa oil depot, which the Russians confirmed supposedly 2 diesel tanks burned down. Ukraine has, according to the Russians, once more shelled the city of Belgorod with multiple launch rocket systems. The Russians claim that dozens of civilians died. I think dozens. I'm not completely sure. Something around 15 to 20, including children. I have no information to this. The context, the circumstances, whether the victim numbers are accurate. But it seems to be clear that there was an attack on Belgorod. I can just say what was reported by the Russians in this context. I can't put it into some context, and I can't say it's wrong or right in this regard. Developments along the front line, we have a really small advance by the Russians here close to Sinkivka in the direction of Kupiansk. There's a geolocalization here that we can see here, and it's right here on that small pathway, so roughly here. This is still considered to be the gray zone, so the contested area between both sides, and we have a fresh advance of the Russians in here. That doesn't mean that they have actually taken that area and that the gray zone is extended, but it seems likely that they are now in control of the forested area, at least at this point here, and thus the gray zone should probably be somewhat extended in the southeast. A Ukrainian officer on a Ukrainian publication is talking about the area there, the front line between Kupiansk and Kremina. And while we are going to ignore his claims of successes, as we have a Ukrainian claiming Ukrainian successes, out of source criticism, we take we rely in changes in territory on one side admitting defeat or on visual evidence. So while we ignore this part, there's still something highly interesting in it. He says the training of the Russians is quite high. So he's admitting that Russia is now sending better trained soldiers. He claims that there are barricade squads, basically units behind the attacking units that are ordered to kill those that are supposed to attack if they don't attack. We know this practice from movies from about World War II. I have to say, though, that I still wait for one evidence of this practice to be implemented. It's being said basically from the beginning of the war. Initially, it was supposedly the Kadyrovtsi, especially around Kiev, who had done that. There is one video of a drone following soldiers that are then being mown down by other soldiers. That could be it, but it felt staged. The movement of the soldiers once the other soldiers appear with guns seems to be prepared for it. The drone seems to be in a follow mode, etc., etc. So in this regard, this video was not conclusive proof to me. It's possible that the Russians use barricade squads, but I still have to see any evidence of them actually doing it, even though I said it's quite possible after all. He also says that the technical equipment of the Russians is also at a good level. So the talks of the Russians bringing scrap to the scrapyard is clearly not confirmed by the Ukrainian officers along the front line here. We have movement along the front line. We have changes in the front line. The next one only south of the Seversky Donetsk here at Vesele. Again, a minor advance along the railroad line here. Again, geolocalization, and you see the curvature and somewhat above it. So roughly the Russians have advanced until here. This is what, another 300 meters, 400 meters close to Vesele in this regard. This fighting is continuing around Ivanivske, Klishivka, Andriivka, etc., but I cannot confirm any change in territory over the last few days. So let's go to the big event. That was the battle for Avdiivka. Avdiivka has clearly fallen. This is confirmed now by the Ukrainians themselves. Obviously, lots of visual evidence is among it that would indicate that the coke plant, the chemical industry in the northwest of Avdiivka, has fallen into Russian hands as well. This would be this area here. Syrsky, the commander-in-chief of the Ukrainian armed forces, said he ordered the retreat to save lives and to prevent an encirclement. Zelensky initially said all Ukrainians made it out, but Brigadier General Alexander Tarnavsky has confirmed that Ukrainians became prisoners of war. There are some videos circling around of supposed prisoners of war, but so far I've only ever seen like 3 or 4 persons per picture. There's also a video of a Ukrainian soldier supposedly calling his mother and his sister filming it from the side, or his wife, I'm not completely sure. And on the subtitles claim that he's saying that he is wounded. He probably lost he had a hit in his back, so he doesn't control his legs anymore. Basically, he's no longer able to move himself. And in that video, he claims he's being left. He was left by his comrades together with 4 other wounded personnel. They were abandoned. I have no idea if that video is true. The context of the fast retreat would give credence to this, but it could be a psyops by the Russians as well. It could be from another context. It could be older. The problem is I can't verify that video, but I can say that there are videos circulating around showing both Ukrainian losses as well as Ukrainian prisoners of war. Supposedly, at least. Russian mill bloggers are saying, though, that there are still pockets of Ukrainians in the 9th district, which would be this here, where the higher buildings are, as well as in the coke plant. This would, if they are true, if this is true, this would then indicate that they are abandoned or that they have been bypassed and that they would be taken out fairly soon. As said, so far I've only seen this from the Russian side. I do not see enough conclusive evidence of bigger numbers of prisoners of war. So we might see some more in the future there. At least the Russians claim that the retreat was definitely not complete and that some units were left behind while the rest of them had retreated. The Russians are also claiming that they don't see Ukrainian activity in Las Tokhkune. So here. So according to them, this town is likely already abandoned by the Ukrainians, and they expect the Ukrainians to make a new defensive line along here. And we can see some water and some elevation would obviously be a likely point of another line of defense or for the next line of defense for the Ukrainians. We'll talk more about the implications of all of this once we are finished with the developments along the front line. So bear with me, it'll just take a little more because not too much has happened along other parts of the front line. We have on the Oblast border, south here, there are always reports first before we go to the Oblast border here in the Marinka area, Pobieda, Novomikhailivka, Georgivka, etc., Krasnohorivka. There were attacks, the Russians are saying though, but even from the pro-Russian mill bloggers that I follow, they don't claim successes here. So it seems the front line has been more or less stable. The Russians are still in the eastern part of Novomikhailivka, but they have not advanced, at least not that I can confirm, and they haven't managed to create a bigger envelopment here or push more to the sides of Novomikhailivka. Here at Velika Novosilka, in the area of the Oblast border, here we have Donetsk and here we have Zaporizhzhia. Close to Novodonetsk, the Russians have had an advance, but a really small one. This should be, let me see, should be this here, yeah. And it's here, and you can see it's like, what is it? 1/5 of that tree line up, more or less. So they are somewhere here in the gray zone, in the former gray zone. As this is a forested area, it seems likely that the Russians have entrenched here now. So we should expect the front line to be by now somewhere here. So probably an advance by 500 to 700 meters along that one tree line, but in overall not a big change in the control. When we go to the area south of Orikhiv, here, by the way, I have nothing else to report. South of Orikhiv, we have fresh claims by the Russians when I finished the research. We have fresh claims that the Russians claim they have reached the they have reached Robotine. Basically, they advanced the rest of the territory here. No confirmation from a Ukrainian side that I've seen until I finished the research. So this might be true, this might not be true. At least it would be in accordance to what the spokesperson for the Ukrainian Tavris group says, because he said the Russians are concentrating troops in the direction of Orikhiv, so basically here. And he said that the Russians have now reached troop levels equivalent to the ones at Avdiivka. And as we've just seen in Avdiivka, they were able to take a city of 31,000 pre-war population with those troop concentrations. And in the past, it was said 50,000 men here. So if that is true, then we should see significant offensive activity in this area pretty soon. When we go to the overall situation, we obviously are going to focus mostly on Avdiivka, and there we have to say the Russians managed to achieve a turning movement. They tried to envelop Avdiivka, the defenders, with attacks from the south and from the north, and with a breakthrough in the center of Avdiivka, or not quite the center, in the area between the coke plant and the city itself, here through the less built up areas, they managed to cut the main line of supply and thus threaten the Ukrainians with complete envelopments. They did not manage to create a pocket to capture and destroy the Ukrainian soldiers in there, because they were not able to advance deep enough and strong enough to break through and then continue advancing at that point. Here they were clearly reaching the limits of their abilities, both when it comes to tactical abilities as well as when it comes in regards to their own strengths in comparison to the Ukrainian defenses. This allowed them, though, to avoid intensive house-to-house fighting in the better built-up areas, and an area where they would have probably where they would have suffered even higher losses, and where the Ukrainians would have suffered higher losses as well. On Telegram, the 3rd Assault Brigade, which was just redeployed to the area of Avdiivka, is claiming that the real number of losses is estimated at 4,200. 200 is the code for fallen, 300 is for wounded. So they claim that they have basically destroyed half a brigade, half to 2/3 of a brigade with their fighting here. Now, the 3rd Assault Brigade has just been redeployed to Avdiivka, clearly to allow the rest of the units to retreat. That seems to be the logical context in this. And both Russians as well as Ukrainians are talking about the high losses here. We have a translation from a Telegram channel from a Russian Colonel Shuvalov Pyotr Ilyich. You can pause the video if you want to read it here. I'll just go through it. Basically, he says that the losses have been significant, and to say that Avdiivka has been abandoned is nonsense. And we have the same here from Ryan O'Leary, who is fighting with the Chosen Company. He's an American volunteer fighting in Ukraine. He also claims that the losses should be much, much higher. This kind of makes sense because the success was forced. They forced the success they had in Avdiivka by just pushing in even more. And in the final days, the fighting had to be the most intense, as the Russians had in their grasp a final envelopment of the Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka. If they had been able to cross that, to close that, they would have captured a huge number of Ukrainian troops there. And if you have that in front of you, it makes sense that you push in even more and more and more, even if the losses are high, because it feels like it's worth the price paying in this context. So that the losses are high seems to be logical in this context, but the losses were definitely not one-sided. I said in the last situation report that there are supposed claims, the supposed social media entries from the 3rd Assault Brigade about hundreds of KIA on their site. It was circled around in pro-Russian Telegram channels, and I was not able to confirm it. But this is an example here. This is supposedly the 3rd Assault Brigade unit being in Avdiivka in position, and I'll just play it, and you can check if you realize something while it's playing through. Let me quickly make it a little quicker. And some of you might have realized they don't have fortifications. They don't have trenches. They don't have dugouts. All they have for protection is lying behind a tree. Now, that tree might be strong enough to stop a 545, but they have no protection whatsoever against drones, against artillery, against multiple launch rocket systems, against mortars. If they have to fight like this and do local counterattacks to push the Russians back a few hundred meters here and there to allow the rest of the troops to evacuate, all of this while being seriously weaker than the enemy, while not having artillery superiority, that basically is predetermined that their losses have to be significant in this context. Now, obviously, we can just look at the positions here. They might have had better positions at some other points. We can argue like this. And this is a point where some of my viewers or some viewers on YouTube prefer to only hear the good news. And we know there are YouTube channels out there that report a victory of Ukraine basically every day, like 98% of the time. But I don't think there's much point in doing this, as it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help even if you're pro-Ukraine. I think Ukraine should prevail in this war. It must prevail. I'm clearly siding with Ukraine in this, but this doesn't mean that I should ignore reality. And the reality is that the Ukrainians have made a lot of questionable things. I don't want to jump to a conclusion in this context yet, because we have more about this and there might be some logical explanations, but at least it must be allowed to ask some questions. And as said, like here we see them not having prepared any positions, and we have an article from the Kiev Independent that leaves a lot of questions to answer. I will, you see it here. If I forget to post it, then just Google for Fate of Avdiivka Uncertain Kiev Independent, and you will have no trouble finding that article. Basically, to summarize the article, they said initially they start off with 2 soldiers. They set in a dugout with half a meter. And here, no deeper than half a meter, and they stayed there for 5 days. Now, I've served in the German army, and we had a trench shovel. I asked myself, don't they have that? Like, how can it be that after 5 days they are still in a 50 centimeter deep, that's less than 2 feet, hole in the ground, if they have equipment to dig in? I can't answer that for you, but that's an obvious question that I start asking myself. Then a soldier of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, the one that was before fighting close to Robotine, he said they basically had barely fortified positions along the front line. He said that a lot of soldiers were complaining that here I think it is there are almost no fortified positions on the very front line near Avdiivka. Now, this article is a couple of days old. It's from the February 10th, so before the city had fallen. There are almost no fortified positions along the front line. So why not? Why haven't they prepared them? Then a lot of soldiers were generally complaining that many infantrymen and other soldiers deployed on the first line of defense have complained that their positions, often just holes like the one described by Alexander, that's the 50-centimeter hole, appear to have been poorly prepared ahead of the major Russian offensive on Avdiivka. But it doesn't continue. It's in doubt that there is even a properly prepared second defensive line. According to the article, persons interviewed said that according to interviews of dozens of soldiers, the second line is just in construction. So it wasn't pre-prepared. The Ukrainians didn't feel the need to prepare defensive lines behind the one they are currently occupying. Again, a question that I can't answer you. I could speculate that this was for morale reasons. If you start building defensive lines across the country, you basically admit that you are on a losing streak, that it's likely of the enemy to come and take those positions, whereas you at the same time claim you're going to liberate Crimea. So this could be a contradiction, but it's incomprehensible to me that a country that has martial law is not asking its workers to at least go out every Saturday for 3 to 6 hours with a shovel and start digging trenches under supervision. If they had done this for the last 2 years in a city, behind a city that's directly on the front line, there would be trenches now. There would be deep trenches now. So there are some things that simply I can't explain to you. And we have the Kiev Independent here. This is not Russia Today. This is not some pro-Russian propaganda outlet. Unless you want to claim that Kiev Independent is suddenly pro-Russian. These are questions asked, the questions that arise by listening to the Ukrainians themselves. But it continues. It is necessary to build a line. This is out of the article. I hope I won't forget to link it to you. It is necessary to build a line of defense with trenches, a system of fire points, minefields, etc. Alexander explained. For us, it's like this. We have trenches and that's it. It's enough. We just need to build a defense line in which the Russian troops, would suffer colossal losses. It's being built, but F word, if it had been built earlier. So it hasn't been built earlier. Why? The Russians, on the other hand, are currently building a defensive line 50 to 70 kilometers behind the front line. In the past, we talked about that the Russians kept building defensive lines before the Ukrainian counteroffensive down to the isthmus of Perikop. They actually even built defensive lines, defensive positions, dugouts, trenches along beaches on the Crimean Peninsula. Now, you can mock that. And we know that the pro-Ukrainian side of the audience is usually likes to say that the Russians are stupid in everything. We can take a positive thing out of this. If the Russians keep building defensive lines far behind the front line, the war is far from the situation of the war is far from conclusive. It's still in doubt. Otherwise, the Russians wouldn't waste those resources. So the percentage is higher than 0% that the Ukrainians will reach that defensive line, 50 to 70 kilometers behind the current front line. Otherwise, the Russians would see no reason whatsoever to pour in resources. But why haven't the Ukrainian poured in resources like this? We had the numbers from Pobjeda, where the Wagner guys, when they were fighting in Popasna, Popasna, Wagner was complaining whenever they enter the town, the Ukrainians simply close the steel doors of their bunkers and ask for artillery fire on their own positions. They had well-built fortifications, as obviously Popasna was right along the contact line, and there they were able to hold back the Russians for almost a year. I think longer than a year or something like this, but yeah, it should have been longer than a year. For a very long time. So the Ukrainians saw how effective it was. But the big initiative to start building fortifications was started in November of 2023. Why is the question that I can't answer you, but it's a question we have to ask ourselves. But the article continues. It's not just artillery issue with it's not just artillery that is suffering in shell shortages. There's also the quote here, compared to the 120 shells allocated to each tank in southern Kherson Oblast during Ukraine's fall 2022 counteroffensive. For example, tanks are now rationed 15 to 20 shells each as of December, according to tank crews with the 59th Brigade. So tank shells are also running out. A BM-21 Grad multiple launch rocket system crew said they are shooting one rocket out of their 40 tubes because they don't have more ammo. This is an area weapon. The BM-21 is not a precision missile unless you have some high-tech GPS-guided special versions, which do exist. I think the Serbians have some, and supposedly they even gave some to the Ukrainians or sold them over some middleman. So unless you have one like this is an area weapon, imprecise. If you shoot one, it's like pure luck. It's a gamble if you even hit anything. But this is the ammunition situation. Now, this ammunition situation, obviously, you have to ask the West. Why didn't the West supply more until now? Do we really want to say that the West is already doing 100% to the dot of what the West is capable of doing? The infantry is running so short, Ukrainians are running so short in infantry that soldiers from artillery and logistics are being sent to the front line to fill up the trenches. They obviously didn't have special infantry training, and they quote a witness that says out of the 15 of his artillery unit, basically all but 4 were taken out within the first days. Because they have no clue what to do on the front line whatsoever, as they have never been trained. And if those are recruited, mobilized personnel, and they were recruited and aimed to be put into the artillery, they might have never learned it. Now, in Germany, you have some basic training, and supposedly everyone is supposed to take it. So this is a little bit like the Marines, I guess, in the US, where everyone's supposed to be a rifleman. In the German army, that was the same in my time. So you could expect a logistics guy, an artillery guy, to at least have some more or less mediocre training for a trench warfare on the front line. But this might be different in Ukraine, where it was about filling up ranks as fast as possible. And why would you teach somebody trench warfare if he's in a logistics unit, if he's in an artillery unit? But this shows the drastic situation when it comes to personnel already. So the situation is far from rosy. Obviously, the Russians have suffered dearly. Whether the Ukraine's numbers are fantasy or not, I tend not to take numbers from either side serious. So I think Ukraine is exaggerating when the numbers that we hear, but the Russian losses have very likely been massive. Whether the Russians are able to keep advancing now after taking Avdiivka, after the Ukrainians are not in properly prepared defensive positions, will be a question we'll have to answer over the next few days, or whether there we'll see if the Russians manage to exploit that situation, or whether their offensive here is going to culminate. Anyways, we are still not ready, but if you don't want to miss this, obviously, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel. The Ukraine is also reporting that they shot down three fighter jets over the Donbas in the last 24 hours. 2 Sukhoi 34, those are the fighter bombers, which you could probably compare somewhat to the Strike Eagle, and 1 Sukhoi 35. The Russians by now have confirmed the loss of the Sukhoi 35. The pilot has ejected and survived, according to the Russians. It could be that the Ukrainian side brought in Patriot system to aid with the defense, with the withdrawal, as once more, the Russian glide bombs have been one of the menaces of the Ukrainians. They aren't too precise, but they can carry up to close to a ton of explosives, and thus having a much higher effect than regular artillery shells. And the Russians were using up to 100, sometimes over 100 per day on Avdiivka alone over the last few days. We have numbers from the Russians. The Russians claimed that 5,000 men were in Avdiivka. No idea if how close to the truth that is. But obviously, if they expect that they can take 5,000 men prisoner, that would be another reason to push in men and keep pushing and keep pushing and keep suffering losses, as they feel they can far easier accept losses and sustain losses than Ukraine can. And if Ukraine should actually lose a full brigade with everyone inside in Avdiivka by encircling them, that would obviously be a massive success for the Russians, especially directly in front of the presidential election. We also have, in this context, when it comes to personnel and losses, Franz Stefan Gadi, an expert who in this matter gave an interview, and he says that there are Ukrainian units that are now at 20 to 30% of their personnel strength. So some Ukrainian units are basically expired at this very moment. They need to be refilled and retrained completely, and we'll have to see how that is going to work over the next few weeks and months. The Russians have fired, to go to a different topic, they have fired Admiral Viktor Sokolov. He was the commander of the Black Sea Fleet, and because of the losses, because of his failures, according to this Russian mill blogger, the interesting part is that his decision also prohibited the installation of non-standard devices and installations on ships. For example, thermal imagers for detecting kamikaze boats, additional heavy machine guns, drones with a thermal imager, and other technological products of from the 21st century. Now, obviously, we can't speculate about the reasons for this, but this is in line, at least this mill blogger is in line with my position, that those naval drones are only an issue if you don't properly prepare for them. Obviously, that takes resources, that are then no longer available somewhere else. If you have to install additional heavy machine guns for their defense, then that room might be lacking in other regards. It might decrease the efficiency in other options, in other missions of that ship. But here in this regard, we see that the Admiral has decided against it. But I think what they are actually saying is probably the most likely solution, together with close range, with helicopter-borne radars to detect the drones a little bit earlier. Then we have news from the Baltic states. The Baltic states have agreed on a fortification line against Russia. In total, they want to build 1,000 bunkers here along the borders here and around Kaliningrad. Those bunkers, at least from Estonia, we know Estonia itself wants to build 600 of them. They are at 37 square meters and made for 10 personnel. That would mean that those 600 soldiers would already fix 6,000 men, and that is an indication that they are probably not all going to be along the front line, and that they are not all going to be manned the whole time. Otherwise, it would fix too big of a part of the Estonian armed forces. What we should expect from those fortifications, and this is obviously not all, they also want to build depots of, for instance, those tank obstacles, personnel obstacles, so they are ready to be deployed in need. They also want to change the environment by planting trees along the roads, probably to prohibit vehicles to leave the roads. They want to increase the depth of drainage trenches, and thus, that's at least my interpretation, thus turning them into tank obstacles at the same time. So if we go back to the bunkers, 600 bunkers, 6,000 men, shows us it's about delaying. That was the obvious conclusion. Bunkers are still effective, but only to a certain degree. And what Estonia needs to do is not stop the Russians along the front line. So putting all the bunkers along the front line and believing you can stop the Russians there in an attack is probably not the right decision. They need to gain time. Every hour that the Russians are held up along the front line by a bunker with 10 soldiers, maybe 180 GM launcher, 2 heavy machine guns or something like this, every hour they gain with this, their reservists have the time to go to their units, to get equipped, to receive their weapon, to receive their ammunition, to occupy other bunkers, to prepare the obstacles. All of this is important. So we should see those bunkers not just along the border, but also on main roads going further inwards, to then, if the first breakthrough has been achieved, to slow down the Russians further into that area as well. In troop generation, we have some information. Putin visited Uralvagonzavod, the tank factory, and he claimed that the tank production is up 5 times, IFV APC production is up 3.5 times, and the Special Technology Center lead designer is saying the Russians are now producing 1,000 Orlan 10 reconnaissance drones per year. Obviously, those numbers are by the Russians, and we've seen in the past that the Russian numbers weren't that far away from the truth, but roughly 20 to 30% higher than the Western estimates. And if we want to take the Western estimates for granted, then we should simply, probably the easiest way is to get closer to reality is by simply deducting 20 to 30% of the numbers that the Russians are giving us. In political areas, we have France and Germany signing a security pact with Ukraine. This is understood. My understanding from this is more a political gesture. It's a treaty according to which the nations plan to do something. They say we are going to do something, but that doesn't mean that they are going to come to Ukraine's aid with weapons, with their soldiers, and it doesn't even guarantee that these security pacts will be fulfilled if the opposition takes the lead in the government. So while this is great for Ukraine, we shouldn't probably take them too serious, because that's just the reality. Germany and France haven't signed an alliance that binds them to come to Ukraine's aid no matter what, and that's simply the fact. The other big news, a lot of other channels are already talking about this, so I'll just put it in here to complete it. Alexei Navalny has died. He was the last prominent or the most prominent opposition figure inside of Russia. Nationalist. I think he supported the annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, but was against the war in Ukraine. So while this will obviously be held against him, what at least demands my respect is that he was poisoned with Novichok. He was evacuated to Germany. He fell into a coma, and the German hospital in Berlin was able to make him recover. And he still returned to Russia despite knowing that the Russian government, likely the Russian government, tried to kill him. He still returned. He was immediately arrested and then sentenced to prison, and sentenced even more to prison. Basically, I think in total his prison sentence was over 30 years by now. It was clear that he wouldn't leave the prison anymore alive unless this regime would fall prior to that. He did that despite knowing, he came back to Russia, despite knowing that Russian government wants to get rid of him. And here I am reminded of Ezra Pound's quote, if a man isn't willing to take risks for his convictions, then either they are worthless or he is worthless. So surely Navalny wasn't the shining example of pluralism and pro-Western Russia or whatever some might see in him. But when it comes to character, he, on my side, simply demands respect. And then again, we have to see that history doesn't just supply us with the perfect examples. We have that in Venezuela, where Guaido, the president of the parliament, was the big hope against Maduro, and Guaido wasn't against the communist Maduro, and Guaido was just a little further to the center. He was still a socialist as well himself. Or let's take the would-be assassins of Adolf Hitler of the 20th of July 1944 in Germany. If you measure them by today's standards, they were probably homophobes. They didn't want pluralistic democracy. Some of them were monarchists. Others of them were paternalists. They would have probably not reintroduced, some of them at least, pluralistic democracy to Germany. But still, they were still heroes trying to do the right thing. And at least in this regard, I think Alexei Navalny deserves the respect. And to some degree, at least from my side, he deserves my admiration. Putin has said in an interview that he prefers Biden as a US president over Trump because he's more predictable. Now, first of all, this could be the truth. There is some pro-Trump theory, or we can take history. We know the madman theory from Richard Nixon. Basically, Richard Nixon is supposed to appear as a president so mad that you can expect everything from him, including nuclear attacks against China. So China better stop helping the Viet Cong and northern Vietnam, so peace is possible. This could theoretically be an interpretation for Trump. I think this is more likely we simply see Putin, the KGB agent, trying to do psyops here. Because obviously, if Putin says he prefers Biden, then Trump can go into the election, then he can go into debates and say, hey, Putin says he prefers Biden, so Biden is Putin's man, not me. So stop the accusations that I'm Putin's man. This seems to be the more likely outcome, whether and this is not the channel to judge Biden and Trump. This is none of my business whom the US, I guess it's everyone's business in the world whom the US votes for president, but this is not the topic of this channel. Just in this context, I think it's more likely that this is a psyops by Putin than anything else. Troop generation, Ukraine, we have something. Zelensky said that 50% of all electronic warfare and air defense is now being built inside of Ukraine. Ukraine is also developing additional electronic warfare and SAM systems, and there are several joint ventures that have started now with Western companies. We talked about it in the past that they were doing joint ventures, preparing them for a cooperation with Ukroboronprom, which is now renamed, and according to them, they are starting production. International aid, we also have something. Germany announced the delivery of 36 additional artillery pieces, self-propelled artillery pieces, but not now. 26 to 27. It's likely that it's going to be 18 Panzerhaubitze 2000 and 18 RCH 155. Germany is going to deliver 120,000 rounds of 122 millimeter. Apparently, Germany bought them somewhere, and those are going to be delivered this year. 2 Skynex air defense systems, 2 additional ones are going to be delivered 2025. 100 IRIS-T missiles in 2024. Spain is going to deliver additional M113 trucks and air defense and long-range weapons for the F-16, so probably AIM-120 MRAMs. Czech Republic has found, that's how they say, they have found 800,000 artillery shells, 500,000 155 and 300,000 122, and they can be delivered in a very short time if other nations are able to pay for them, because they obviously have to be bought first. I'm not sure, but it's possible that the 120,000 122s from Germany are part of that deal, or that they could be additional. We simply don't know at that point, but at least there's some fresh artillery on the horizon. And finally, before we finish, we have a video here of something that some of you might have wondered. We see actually a Shilka in operation. Shilka is the ZSU-23-4 that was the first air defense, mobile air defense system with radar guidance, etc., that was introduced in the Soviet army. The Ukrainians supposedly had a 3-digit number of them at the beginning of the war, even though we saw a depot being overrun where dozens of them were in it in eastern Ukraine. And now we see them in operation here, firing at Shahid drones, trying to take them down. I'm not completely sure if it's possible, if they manage to achieve it, but there you see they are in existence and they are being worked. They are doing their job. That was it from me for now. Long situation report today. I hope you still liked it despite the seriousness of the topic. I try to do an objective job here. I openly say that I'm not neutral in this conflict. I am not. But I don't think lying to yourself or to your audience is the right thing. And that means that both I need to address negative things that are counter Ukraine, even though you can see on YouTube that channels who only report victories are far, far more successful than my channel. So maybe it would be a way to bigger success, but I won't lie to myself, so I won't lie to you. In things where I see how it is, I'm going to report this the way it is. But so this is the objectiveness, and obviously to not lie to my audience. I'm also not claiming to be neutral. You probably know some channels of that too who claim to be neutral and clearly show a bias towards one side. I don't think pure actually being neutral in this conflict is possible. I am not. I'm transparent with it, but I do my best not to lie to you, to stick to the actual facts. And if you enjoy this, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment what you think about today's situation report and the events. And if you're new here, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so I can finally reach the 100,000. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much to everyone already supporting this channel. And that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.